It was a warm summer afternoon. The sun cast golden rays over the shimmering water of the neighborhood pool. The sound of laughter and splashing filled the air as families enjoyed their day. The protagonist, a disabled man in his late 50s, sat at the edge of the pool, soaking his legs in the cool water. He lived in this community for years, and though he didn't swim often, he loved the peacefulness of the poolside. Then, she arrived. A middle-aged woman, dressed in an expensive sun hat and sunglasses, marched toward him with a look of pure disapproval. Her presence instantly changed the atmosphere. Conversations quieted as people noticed the tension. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp. "You can't be here." The protagonist turned his head, confused. "What do you mean?" "This pool is for residents only," she snapped. "You need to leave." His brow furrowed. "I am a resident." She scoffed, looking him up and down, eyes lingering on his mobility aid beside him. "I've never seen you here before. What house do you live in?" He sighed, not wanting to make a scene. "I live in this neighborhood. I've been here for years." She crossed her arms. "I don't believe you." The protagonist remained calm, but he could feel people watching. He knew exactly who this woman was, one of those HOA types. The kind that acted like they owned the place. Then, without another word, she pulled out her phone. "I'm calling 911, she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "There's a suspicious man at the pool. He refuses to leave." A few gasps echoed around them. A mother pulled her children closer. The protagonist's stomach twisted as he watched her press the call button. Within seconds, the sound of police sirens filled the air. The protagonist took a deep breath, gripping the arms of his chair. He had done nothing wrong, but he knew how these situations could go. People started recording. The woman smirked, standing tall as if she had already won. As the squad car pulled up and two officers stepped out, everyone held their breath. What happened next shocked everyone. The two police officers stepped out of their car, their boots crunching against the pavement. Their faces were unreadable, but their hands rested near their belts as they approached the scene. The tension in the air was thick, everybody at the pool had gone quiet, watching. The woman, still gripping her phone, put on an expression of fake relief and waved them over. "Thank goodness you're here, officers," she said dramatically. "This man is trespassing. I asked him to leave, but he refused. He's not a resident here." The protagonist sat still, gripping the wheels of his chair. His heart pounded, but he kept his voice steady. "I am a resident," he said, looking the officers in the eyes. One officer, a tall man with a serious expression, glanced at him and then at the woman. The second officer, shorter and younger, seemed unsure. "We got a report of a suspicious individual refusing to leave private property," the tall officer said. "Sir, do you have an ID on you?" The protagonist nodded, moving slowly to reach for his wallet. He knew better than to make any sudden movements in situations like this. As he pulled out his ID, the woman scoffed loudly. "Oh, come on," she sneered. "He's obviously just making something up. These types always try to fake documents." The crowd murmured. Someone near the pool whispered, "Did she really just say these types?" The protagonist clenched his jaw but stayed quiet. He handed his ID to the officer. The officer examined it, then frowned slightly. "You live in this neighborhood?" "I have for years," the protagonist said firmly. "I pay HOA fees. I've used this pool before." The shorter officer took the ID and turned to the woman. "Ma'am, do you have any proof that he doesn't live here?" Her face turned red. Well, I don't recognize him." "That's enough, isn't it?" The taller officer sighed. "Not really." But Karen wasn't done. She leaned in, her eyes narrowing. "Look, maybe he does technically live here, but why is he even here alone? If he's really disabled, he should have someone with him. It's dangerous for someone like him to be near water." The protagonist felt his stomach drop. He had dealt with ignorance before, but this was beyond insulting. People in the crowd gasped. A mother who had been watching suddenly spoke up. "Are you serious right now?" she snapped at the woman. "You just called the cops on a disabled man at his own pool, and now you're trying to say he can't be here because he's disabled? Do you even hear yourself?" Karen's eyes widened. I was just looking out for safety." The officers glanced at each other. The shorter one cleared his throat and took a step back. "Sir," he said to the protagonist, "you're saying you've lived here for years?" "Yes." "And you've had no issues using the pool before?" "Not until she showed up." The officers exchanged another look, then turned back to the woman. "Ma'am," the taller officer said, crossing his arms, "you called us here for a trespassing complaint. But the person you reported is a resident. That means you just wasted police resources." The woman's face twisted in frustration. What? No, I was just following the rules. We need to keep an eye on people who don't belong." The officer gave her a sharp look. "And what made you so sure he didn't belong?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The pool was silent. People stared at her, waiting for an answer. Then, from behind the officers, a deep voice spoke up. "I can confirm that he lives here." Heads turned as a security guard from the neighborhood stepped forward. He was an older man, dressed in a polo shirt with the HOA logo. "I've seen him around plenty of times," the guard continued. "He's never caused trouble." "But you, ma'am?" He gave the woman a pointed look. "You seem to cause problems a lot." Karen's face drained of color. The protagonist finally exhaled, feeling a small victory, but it wasn't over yet. She wasn't done fighting. Because then she did something that made everything even worse. For a moment, the entire pool area was silent. The security guard's words hung in the air, and the woman, Karen, looked as if she had been slapped. I was just trying to make sure everything was safe," she stammered, stepping back. "It's not my fault if people don't follow the rules." The taller officer sighed. "Ma'am, you called 911 for a trespassing complaint, but this man lives here. That means you wasted police resources and made a false report." Karen's face twitched. No, I didn't. I was just doing my duty as a member of the HOA." The protagonist, still sitting calmly in his chair, took a deep breath. He had seen this type before, people who never admitted when they were wrong. But now, the police were here, the security guard had confirmed his identity, and Karen was running out of excuses. The younger officer, who had been quiet so far, flipped open a small notepad. "Sir," he said, turning to the protagonist, "do you have any proof of residency? A piece of mail, an HOA bill, anything like that?" The protagonist nodded. "I have my lease and my HOA membership in my house. I can go get it." Karen rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. Anyone can fake a document. How do we know it's real?" The security guard turned to her sharply. "Karen, stop. I've been working here for years. I know who lives in this community. You don't get to decide who belongs here." Karen's hands clenched into fists. Her jaw tightened. "Well, if he's really disabled, then why is he here alone?" The words hit harder than anything she had said before. The protagonist inhaled sharply. "Oh. So that's what this was about. It wasn't enough that he lived here. It wasn't enough that he followed the rules. She didn't think he belonged because of his disability." The pool area went dead silent. Someone muttered, "Oh, that's just disgusting." The protagonist clenched his jaw but stayed calm. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his disability card, proof from his doctor, confirming his condition. He held it up. "Here," he said simply. "You wanted proof? This is proof." Karen squinted at it, but before she could speak, the younger officer took the card, looked at it, and nodded. "That's valid," he said. Karen's face twisted. She looked around desperately, as if searching for support. But the crowd that had gathered around was not on her side. A woman in a swimsuit crossed her arms. "Karen, you need to stop. You literally just called the cops on a disabled man at his own pool. You look ridiculous." A young father nearby added, "You don't own this place. Just because you're in the HOA doesn't mean you control everything." Karen's eyes flicked between them, her breath quickening. The taller officer turned to the protagonist. "Sir, I'm sorry you had to go through this." The protagonist nodded. "I appreciate that." But Karen wasn't done yet. Instead of apologizing, she snapped. "You know what? Fine. But if you fall in that pool, don't expect me to feel bad for you." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The protagonist's face remained calm, but inside, he was boiling. Karen turned to the officers, arms crossed. "So, what? Are you gonna arrest me for trying to keep the pool safe?" The taller officer narrowed his eyes. "Ma'am, I suggest you step away before you make this worse for yourself." Karen scoffed, but backed up slightly. And then, the HOA president arrived. A tall man in a polo shirt and sunglasses stepped forward. He had clearly been called by someone, and he did not look happy. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded. The protagonist exhaled. Finally, someone with real authority was here. Karen turned to the HOA president, her voice sickly sweet. "Oh, thank goodness you're here. I caught this man sneaking into the pool, and these officers don't seem to care. I was just enforcing the rules." The HOA president cut her off. "Karen," he said, voice cold. "This man is a resident. You just called 911 on one of our own." Karen's mouth dropped open. The officers turned to the HOA president. "Are you saying she had no authority to remove him?" "That's exactly what I'm saying." Karen turned pale. I was just trying to help." The protagonist watched, waiting for what would come next. Because Karen was about to realize that she wasn't as powerful as she thought. And this? This was only the beginning of her downfall. The HOA president's words hung in the air, heavy with finality. The pool area was completely silent, all eyes locked on Karen. She blinked, as if trying to process what had just happened. I was just doing my duty," she stammered. "It's my responsibility to keep this place safe." The HOA president exhaled sharply, clearly losing patience. "Karen, let me make something very clear. You do not have the authority to remove residents from their own community spaces. You're not security. You're not the police. And you have no right to call 911 on someone just because you don't like them being here." Karen's face turned bright red, but she wasn't backing down just yet. "I was following the rules," she insisted. "We have guidelines about who can use the pool. And I've never seen him here before. How was I supposed to know?" The taller officer shook his head. "Maybe by asking instead of assuming?" A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. Karen's jaw tightened. The protagonist remained silent, watching as Karen dug herself into a deeper hole. He had nothing to prove, everyone here could see what was really happening. Then, someone else stepped forward. A woman in her late 40s, dressed in workout clothes, crossed her arms and fixed Karen with an icy glare. "Oh, come on, Karen. We all know what this is really about." Karen snapped her head toward her. "What are you talking about, Lisa?" Lisa scoffed. "You do this all the time. You harass people who don't fit your perfect little image of what this neighborhood should look like. Last month, you tried to find the Johnsons because their grass was half an inch too tall. The month before that, you called the HOA because a single mom let her kid ride his bike in the cul-de-sac. And now you're calling the cops on a disabled man at his own pool?" Karen's face twisted in rage. "That's not the same thing." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Isn't it?" The crowd murmured in agreement. A young man near the diving board spoke up next. "Yeah, my parents got a notice from you because we had a Halloween decoration up for too long." You act like you own this place. More and more people started speaking up. She tried to fine us for parking in front of our own house. She yelled at my kids for using sidewalk chalk. She told my grandmother she couldn't have a garden gnome because it wasn't HOA approved. Karen whipped around, eyes darting between the growing number of people calling her out. The protagonist sat back in his chair, watching Karen's perfect little world collapse around her. The HOA president shook his head in frustration. Karen, I have received multiple complaints about your behavior. And now? Calling the police on an innocent resident? This is unacceptable. Karen clenched her fists. I was just following The taller officer cut her off. Ma'am, do you realize that making a false police report is a crime? Karen's face went sheet white. The shorter officer nodded. We could charge you with misuse of emergency services. You called 911 for a crime that didn't exist. The crowd murmured in shock. Karen staggered back, her breath quickening. I didn't know. I thought. The taller officer sighed. Look, at this point, I'd suggest you stop talking before you make things worse for yourself. For the first time, Karen looked truly scared. The HOA president turned to the protagonist. I'm so sorry you had to go through this. You have every right to be here. And I promise you, Karen will be facing serious consequences for this. The protagonist gave a small nod. I appreciate that. Karen looked around desperately, but she found no support. Not a single person was on her side anymore. And then, the final blow came. The taller officer pulled out his notepad. Ma'am, we're going to have to take an official report of this incident. We need your full name. Karen froze. And in that moment, it hit her, this wasn't going to go away. This was the beginning of her downfall. Karen stood frozen, her face pale as the officer held his notepad out toward her. The weight of the situation finally seemed to sink in. My name, she stammered. The taller officer didn't even blink. Yes, ma'am. Your full name for the report. Karen's hands trembled. Wait. Hold on a second. I don't think this is really necessary. It was just a misunderstanding. The crowd murmured in disbelief. Lisa, the woman who had called her out earlier, scoffed. Oh, now it's a misunderstanding? The protagonist remained quiet, watching the scene unfold. He could see the panic in Karen's eyes. She was losing control of the situation, and she knew it. The HOA president crossed his arms. Karen, you called 911 on a resident. You accused him of trespassing without evidence. And when the police arrived, you doubled down instead of admitting you were wrong. That is not a misunderstanding. Karen flushed red, her hands balling into fists. The shorter officer, still holding his notepad, sighed. Ma'am, are you refusing to give us your name? Karen's lips parted, but no words came out. She was stuck. If she refused, she'd be making things worse. The protagonist exhaled slowly. He wasn't one for revenge, but he couldn't deny that seeing Karen sweat like this felt satisfying. Then, the HOA president spoke again. You know what? He turned to the officers. I'll give you her name. Karen's eyes widened in horror. Wait. You don't have to do that. But it was too late. The president rattled off Karen's full name and address. The officers wrote it down without hesitation. Karen looked around wildly, as if searching for someone, anyone, to defend her. But the people who once tolerated her HOA tyranny now stood with arms crossed, shaking their heads. Then, the shorter officer spoke up. Ma'am, we're going to issue a formal warning for misuse of emergency services. If this happens again, you could face criminal charges. Karen's mouth fell open. What? But I didn't mean. The taller officer cut her off. You can either accept the warning, or we can take this down to the station and escalate it. Your choice. The pool area fell silent. Karen's face twisted in humiliation. She looked at the officers, then at the crowd. People who once feared her HOA rule now stood against her. Her shoulders slumped. Fine. She gritted her teeth. I'll take the warning. The taller officer nodded. Good choice. The officers finished writing the report, then turned to the protagonist. Sir, do you want to press charges for harassment? The crowd went dead silent. Karen's head snapped up. Wait, what? No. This isn't harassment. But everyone else knew the truth. The protagonist took a deep breath, thinking. Part of him wanted to. Part of him wanted Karen to feel the consequences of her actions. But then he thought about it. Would pressing charges really change someone like her? Or would it just make her play the victim even harder? After a moment, he shook his head. No, he said simply. She's embarrassed enough already. Karen flinched. The taller officer nodded. Understood. But if she ever bothers you again, call us. The protagonist gave a small smile. I will. The officers stepped away, making their way back toward their car. The taller officer looked at Karen one last time. Ma'am, I suggest you start thinking before you act. Next time, you might not get off with just a warning. And with that, they left. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but not before several people approached the protagonist. You handled that better than I would have, Lisa admitted with a chuckle. Another man shook his head. She had that coming for a long time. The protagonist simply nodded. He hadn't done anything special, he had just stood his ground. Karen, meanwhile, stood frozen in place. Humiliated. Powerless. For the first time ever, she wasn't in control. But she wasn't done yet. Because as the HOA president turned to leave, Karen did something that made everything even worse. For a moment, it seemed like everything was over. The police had left, the crowd was dispersing, and the protagonist finally felt a sense of peace. But then, Karen did something that changed everything. She whirled around and stormed up to the HOA president, her face still red with anger. You can't just let this go, she snapped. He was dangerous. He could have fallen into the pool and drowned. What if he had sued us? What if? The HOA president held up a hand. Karen, stop. But she wasn't listening. She was too far gone. I want him banned from the pool, she declared, her voice shaking with rage. People like him don't belong here anyway. It's a liability. The entire pool area fell into stunned silence. The protagonist felt a sharp, cold anger settle in his chest. Karen had just said the quiet part out loud. She didn't care about rules. She didn't care about safety. She just didn't want him there. Lisa, the woman who had stood up to Karen earlier, let out a loud laugh. Wow. Just wow. You really don't know when to quit, do you? Karen spun around. Shut up, Lisa. The HOA president rubbed his temples, looking exhausted. Karen, I need you to listen to me very carefully. But before he could continue, a voice interrupted. I'd like to file a formal complaint against Karen. Everyone turned to see the security guard, standing with his arms crossed. Karen's eyes widened. What? The security guard nodded. She's been abusing her power in this community for years. And now, she's trying to ban a disabled resident from the pool after calling the police on him for no reason? He turned to the HOA president. This is harassment, plain and simple. Karen staggered back. Why, you can't do that. But it was too late. Another resident stepped forward. I second that complaint. Then another. And another. Within seconds, a small crowd had gathered, all filing complaints against Karen. The HOA president let out a slow sigh. Karen, I think it's time we have a serious talk about your role in this community. Karen's face drained of color. Wait. No. You can't. The HOA president turned to the security guard. I'll be reviewing her actions with the HOA board. Effective immediately, she is suspended from any decision-making roles. Karen gasped. What? No. You can't do this. I am the HOA. Lisa rolled her eyes. No, Karen. You were the HOA. The security guard smirked. And I'm guessing after tonight's meeting, she won't be anymore. Karen's hand shook with rage. This isn't fair. I was trying to protect the community. The HOA president folded his arms. You were trying to control it. And now, you're facing the consequences. Karen looked around desperately, but she found no support. People she once ruled over were now standing against her. The protagonist finally spoke. This was never about rules, he said calmly. It was about power. And you just lost yours. Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Because she knew he was right. And for the first time in years, Karen was powerless. Karen stood frozen, her chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. The power she had held for years was slipping through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The HOA president turned to the security guard. Filed a complaint with the board. We'll be reviewing her status as soon as possible. Karen staggered back, shaking her head. Wait. You can't just remove me. I'm on the HOA board. I have a say in this. The security guard smirked. Not anymore. A few people in the crowd clapped. Karen's eyes flicked between the faces around her, faces that once looked at her with hesitation, with fear of her ridiculous HOA fines and rules. But now? They looked at her like she was a joke. The protagonist watched it all happen in silence. He had seen people like Karen before, people who thrived on control, who felt powerful by making others feel small. And now, she had lost everything. But just when it seemed like things were over, a new twist appeared. One of the residents, an older man in a Hawaiian shirt, cleared his throat. You know, he said, adjusting his sunglasses, Karen's been pulling this kind of nonsense for years. But now that she's officially in trouble, shouldn't we start looking into everything else she's done? Karen's head snapped toward him. Excuse me? Lisa nodded. He's right. You fined people for things that weren't even in the HOA rules. You've harassed neighbors over things you just didn't like. Another woman stepped forward. And what about the extra fees you charged for violations that weren't real? Where did all that money go, Karen? The crowd murmured in agreement. The HOA president's expression darkened. That's a good question. Karen swallowed hard. Oh, come on. I was just following regulations. There's nothing to investigate. The protagonist narrowed his eyes. She was lying. And everyone knew it. The HOA president turned to the security guard. Pull up the financial records for the last few years. Let's see where those fines actually went. Karen froze. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Because for the first time ever, she wasn't just facing public humiliation. She was facing real consequences. Lisa let out a satisfied hum. Something tells me you're not gonna like what they find, Karen. Karen's fingers twitched, and then, she ran. She turned on her heel and stormed away, her sandals slapping against the pavement. Karen, where are you going? The HOA president called after her. She didn't answer. She just kept walking, disappearing toward the parking lot. The security guard chuckled. Guess she doesn't want to stick around for the investigation. The crowd slowly began to disperse, people whispering amongst themselves, already eager to see what the financial review would uncover. The protagonist sat still, watching as Karen's illusion of control shattered completely. And for the first time in a long time, the community finally felt free. But Karen wasn't done just yet. Because 2 days later, the protagonist got a letter that changed everything. 2 days had passed since the pool incident, and the protagonist had moved on. He had hoped that Karen would quietly disappear, that her days of terrorizing the neighborhood were over. But then, the letter arrived. It was slipped under his door, no stamp, no return address. Just a plain white envelope with his name scrawled across the front. The moment he saw it, he had a bad feeling. He opened it, unfolded the single piece of paper inside, and started reading. "You think you've won? You have no idea who you're messing with. I have connections, and I'm not going anywhere. Enjoy your little victory while it lasts. Because soon, you'll regret ever crossing me." There was no signature, but he didn't need one. It was Karen. The protagonist exhaled slowly. She was still trying to intimidate him. He had two options. Ignore it and hope she finally gave up. Report it and make sure this was documented. He didn't hesitate. He took the letter straight to the HOA president. The moment the president saw it, his expression darkened. "Oh, this is bad. Really bad." The security guard, who had been reviewing Karen's financial records, walked over. "What's going on?" The president handed him the letter. He read it, let out a low whistle, and shook his head. "She really doesn't know when to quit, huh?" The protagonist crossed his arms. "She's trying to scare me." "I don't scare easily." The security guard nodded. "Good. Because after what we just found in her financial records? She's gonna have way bigger problems than you." The protagonist raised an eyebrow. "What did you find?" The HOA president sighed. "Enough evidence to prove that Karen has been stealing money from HOA fines for years." The protagonist blinked. "Excuse me?" The security guard pulled out a stack of printed reports. Turns out, a lot of the fines she handed out never actually made it into the HOA's official records. We're talking thousands of dollars unaccounted for. The protagonist let out a slow breath. So she wasn't just power-hungry. She was a thief. The president nodded grimly. "And now, we have enough proof to take legal action." Karen's little empire was officially crumbling. The president picked up his phone. "I'm calling the police. This just became a criminal investigation." The protagonist watched as the president spoke to the authorities, explaining the situation. Within an hour, a squad car pulled up outside Karen's house. The entire neighborhood watched as two officers knocked on her door. At first, she didn't answer. Then, the door cracked open. The officer spoke to her for a moment. She shook her head, arms crossed, face twisted in defiance. Then one officer held up a piece of paper. A warrant. Karen's expression shattered. She tried to argue. She tried to fight. But in the end, she was escorted out of her house in handcuffs. The protagonist stood among the neighbors, watching as Karen was placed into the back of the squad car. She locked eyes with him for a split second. And for the first time ever, her face wasn't filled with anger. It was filled with fear. The squad car drove away, disappearing down the street. A cheer erupted from the crowd. Lisa turned to the protagonist with a grin. "I think that's the last we'll be seeing of her." The protagonist gave a small nod. "Looks like it." The HOA president clapped his hands together. "All right, everyone. Let's move forward from this. No more unfair fines, no more harassment. It's time to make this neighborhood a community again." The protagonist finally felt at peace. But there was still one last thing left to say. Because at the end of it all, there was a lesson to be learned. The neighborhood was different now. For years, Karen had controlled it like a queen on a throne, dictating who was welcome, who was a problem, and who should be punished for the smallest infractions. But now? She was gone. After her arrest, word spread fast. People talked. Stories were shared. And soon, the full truth about Karen's reign of power was exposed. It turned out she had been pocketing HOA fines for years, issuing fake violation notices, and keeping the money for herself. She used scare tactics, threats, and intimidation to silence anyone who dared to question her. But the moment she called the police on the wrong person, a man who had done nothing wrong, her empire of fear began to crumble. And now? Now, she wasn't coming back. The cleanup. In the weeks following her arrest, the HOA board held a community-wide meeting. For the first time in years, it wasn't about petty rules, unfair fines, or neighborhood politics. It was about fixing what had been broken. The HOA president stood in front of a packed clubhouse, facing dozens of residents who had gathered to finally have their voices heard. First off, he said, looking around, I owe all of you an apology. Karen was allowed to run this HOA unchecked for far too long, and that's on us. But that changes today. Murmurs of approval filled the room. The protagonist sat near the back, watching quietly as real change took place. The first thing they did was review every fine and violation Karen had ever issued. Over 80% of them were fake. Families who had been forced to pay hundreds, sometimes thousands, of dollars were refunded. The board also officially banned Karen from ever holding an HOA position again. More importantly, the president continued, we are implementing new rules to make sure this never happens again. No single person will have unchecked power over this community. No one should feel like they're being watched, controlled, or targeted in their own home. A wave of relief spread through the room. Lisa, the woman who had stood up to Karen at the pool, raised her hand. Does this mean we can finally decorate our homes the way we want, without getting fined? Laughter rippled through the crowd. The president smiled. Yes. Reasonable guidelines will still be in place, but we're getting rid of all the unnecessary restrictions. No more petty rules. No more power trips. A man in the front row raised his hand. And what about Karen? The president's smile faded. Well, as most of you know, she's facing multiple charges. Financial fraud, harassment, and misuse of emergency services. The police are still investigating, but from what I've heard, she's looking at some serious consequences. A woman in the back muttered, about time. The president nodded. She's gone. And now? We move forward. Applause erupted through the clubhouse. For the first time in a long time, things finally felt right. A final conversation. After the meeting, the protagonist was wheeling himself toward the exit when Lisa caught up to him. She gave him a grin. I hope you know that you're kind of a legend around here now. He chuckled. Oh yeah? Oh yeah. She leaned against the doorframe. You stood your ground. You didn't let her intimidate you. And you proved, in front of the whole community, that no one is above consequences. He smiled. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I just wanted to sit by the pool. Lisa laughed. Well, turns out you did a lot more than that. She hesitated for a moment, then added, it's crazy, you know? How one person can control so many people for so long. But the second someone finally stands up, the whole thing falls apart. The protagonist nodded slowly. Bullies only have power if you let them. Lisa thought about that, then smiled. Well, whatever the case, I'm glad you were the one to finally take her down. She turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and one more thing. He raised an eyebrow. Yeah? You should come to the pool more often, she said with a smirk. I think you've earned a permanent VIP pass. He laughed. I just might. And with that, she walked away, leaving him to sit for a moment, taking in everything that had happened. The life lesson. That night, the protagonist sat on his back porch, staring up at the clear night sky. It was finally over. Karen was gone. The neighborhood was free. And for the first time in years, people weren't afraid anymore. And as he sat there, reflecting on everything, he realized something important. Karen wasn't special. She wasn't a monster, a mastermind, or some all-powerful figure. She was just a person who let her hunger for control consume her. And that's how it always is with people like her. Bullies only seem powerful because no one stops them. But the second someone stands their ground, the second someone refuses to back down, the whole illusion falls apart. And the best part? You don't even have to fight them. All you have to do is expose them. Because once people see the truth, the bully's power disappears. Just like that. He smiled to himself, breathing in the fresh night air. Tomorrow? Tomorrow, he was going to the pool. And this time? No one was going to stop him.